Hospitals. The place where we go to heal. But what if I told you that the person sworn to save lives was actually ending them? That behind the gentle smile of a Pennsylvania nurse lurked a serial killer who preyed on the weak and the vulnerable in the dead of night? This is the terrifying true story of Charles Cullen, aka the Angel of Death, America's most prolific serial killer who turned hospital beds into death traps. A man who claimed he was saving lives while stealing them away in the dead of night. Stay with me because this case is darker than you could ever imagine. Subscribe now and turn on the notification icon for more shocking true crime stories, because some truths are scarier than fiction. For 16 years, Charles Cullen walked through the hallways of hospitals across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, blending in with the hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the quiet murmurs of patients slipping in and out of sleep. He was just another face in the crowd, a nurse in scrubs, a man who moved with purpose, who charted vitals, adjusted foredrips, and whispered reassurances in the dead of night. To his patients he was a guardian. To his colleagues he was just another member of the team. But to those who never made it out of his care, he was something else entirely. His victims never saw it coming. They weren't in dark alleys or abandoned houses. They weren't chased through the streets or lured into traps. They were lying in hospital beds, surrounded by beeping machines, trusting the very person who was supposed to keep them alive. And yet, one by one they died, under mysterious circumstances, without struggle, without warning. A sudden crash in vitals. A heart that simply stopped. Families were told it was an unfortunate complication. A tragedy. A sad but explainable loss. But was it? If it had happened once, maybe. Twice. Suspicious. But dozens of times? In different hospitals? Under the care of the same man? Hospital administrators noticed. Nurses whispered. Doctors exchanged glances when another patient coded unexpectedly. The patterns were there, but instead of confronting them, hospitals let Cullen slip away. No police reports. No investigations. Just a quiet resignation, a signature on a piece of paper, and a fresh start at another hospital, where the cycle would begin again. How does a man kill again and again in places designed to save lives? How does he walk through the front doors of a hospital, knowing that before his shift ends, someone will die by his hand? And why, despite so many red flags, so many questions, was he allowed to continue? Evil doesn't always appear as a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it walks the halls of a hospital, blending in so perfectly that no one thinks to question it. But to understand how Charles Cullen became the man who preyed on the weak and the dying, we have to go back to where it all began. Charles Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, the youngest of 8 children in a struggling New Jersey family. His father, a bus driver, died before Charles was even a year old, leaving behind a widow and a household already on the brink of collapse. From the very start, life did not deal him a fair hand. His home was not one filled with warmth and security, but with chaos, struggle, and a sense of isolation that never seemed to leave him. He grew up surrounded by neglect, by siblings who were too busy trying to survive themselves, by a mother who did her best but couldn't shield him from the hardships that came with poverty. And then, when he was just a teenager, the one person he had relied on, his mother, was ripped away from him. Her death was sudden, the result of a car accident. But for Charles it was more than just a loss, it was the breaking point. The hospital where she had been taken, the very place that was supposed to care for her, cremated her body without even informing him or his siblings. It was a moment that changed him, that hardened something inside him. He had already been a lonely, withdrawn child. Now he was an angry, aimless young man with no direction, no sense of belonging, and a growing resentment toward the institutions that had failed him. By the time he was in high school, Cullen was barely holding himself together. He was bullied relentlessly, mocked for his awkwardness, his small frame, his strange behavior. He didn't fit in. He didn't make friends easily. And as the years went on, his thoughts became darker, more violent. At just 9 years old, he attempted to take his own life for the first time, ingesting chemicals from a chemistry set. It would not be his last attempt. He tried again as a teenager, again in his early adulthood, and several more times throughout his life. Each time he survived. Each time he grew more detached from the world around him. Each time the thoughts of death, of control over life itself, became more familiar. Looking for structure, for a place where he could finally belong, Cullen joined the U.S. Navy in 1978. But if he thought military life would give him purpose, he was wrong. Almost immediately, his odd behavior set him apart. He was assigned to work on nuclear submarines, one of the most high-pressure environments imaginable. But his superiors quickly noticed that something wasn't right. He was unpredictable, unhinged. He would be caught sitting at the control panels, staring blankly at nothing. He tampered with equipment without explanation. He would show up in unauthorized areas, unsettling his fellow crew members. And then there was the incident that would become infamous, the moment that should have been a clear warning of what was to come. One night, Cullen was found sitting in the missile control room of the USS Woodrow Wilson, fully suited up in a surgical mask, gloves, and scrubs. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had no reason to be there. And when asked what he was doing, he offered no real explanation. It was unsettling. Bizarre. A red flag that could not be ignored. But instead of being discharged for mental instability, he was quietly reassigned. Eventually, his erratic behavior became too much, and he was given an administrative discharge. Once again, a system that should have held him accountable simply let him walk away. After leaving the Navy, Charles Cullen needed a new path, a new identity, and he found it in the last place anyone would expect: medicine. He enrolled in nursing school, and for the first time in his life, he seemed to have found his purpose. The boy who had been bullied, the young man who had always felt powerless, now had control. People trusted him. They listened to him. They depended on him. And most importantly, they were vulnerable in his care. He graduated in 1986 and was quickly hired as a nurse. To those around him, he seemed like the perfect fit for the job. He was quiet, competent, dedicated. He worked long shifts, never complained, never stood out in a way that raised alarms. But underneath the calm exterior, something was already festering. Just months into his first job, patients under his care began to die. Unexplained. Unexpected. And in numbers that were too high to ignore. Most killers are shaped by their past, their trauma, and their need for power. But Charles Cullen wasn't a man who lashed out in a fit of rage. He didn't attack his victims in a moment of passion. His was a slow, methodical kind of evil. And now that he had found his way into hospitals, into a world where death was common, where no one would question a patient's sudden decline, he had found the perfect hunting ground. Would you trust your nurse with your life? Let me know in the comments below. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, sanctuaries where the sick and the vulnerable are cared for by the hands of professionals. But for over 16 years in hospitals across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, one nurse turned these sanctuaries into silent crime scenes. Between 1988 and 2003, Charles Cullen walked the halls of more than 9 hospitals and a nursing home. And everywhere he went, people died. His method was subtle, insidious, and terrifyingly effective. Unlike killers who rely on brute force, Cullen understood that the right poison, in the right dose at the right time, could turn a routine hospital death into something completely undetectable. He had access to an arsenal of deadly medications: insulin, digoxin, epinephrine, drugs that could cause cardiac arrest in an instant or trigger a slow, agonizing decline. These weren't exotic poisons. They were everyday medications used to save lives. But in Cullen's hands, they became his weapons. His fingerprints were never found on a murder weapon because the weapon itself was invisible, disguised as medical treatment. At first, his murders were scattered, seemingly random. He would select a patient. Someone old, someone weak, someone who wouldn't raise suspicion if they died. A slight overdose of insulin would send blood sugar plummeting to fatal levels. A dose of digoxin, a heart medication, would make the heart beat wildly out of control until it simply gave out. Epinephrine in excess could create sudden chaos in the body. But Cullen didn't always inject patients directly. That would be too risky. Instead, he devised a method that allowed him to kill from a distance, ensuring that even nurses who had never met him would unknowingly carry out his crimes. He began tainting IV bags. In hospitals, IV bags are prepared and stored in advance, ready to be hung by any nurse caring for a patient. No one questions the integrity of a sealed IV bag. No one inspects every single one before administering it. Cullen knew this. And so, he would quietly inject a lethal dose of medication into random IV bags, then return them to storage. Hours later, maybe even days, a nurse would take that bag, spike it, and start the drip, completely unaware that they were delivering a dose of death. A patient's condition would suddenly deteriorate. Doctors would scramble, unable to explain why a once stable patient was crashing. And Cullen would watch. Sometimes he would even be the one to step in, pretending to help, pretending to care, all while knowing exactly what was happening. The deaths didn't go unnoticed. They couldn't. A hospital is filled with doctors and nurses trained to recognize patterns, and the pattern was undeniable. When Cullen was on shift, the death rate spiked. There were murmurs, uneasy glances exchanged in break rooms, whispered conversations among staff members who suspected something wasn't right. Some nurses raised concerns. Some even went to hospital administrators. But at every turn the system failed. Because instead of reporting him, instead of launching full-scale investigations, hospitals took the easy way out. They let him resign. Again and again. Cullen would be quietly told to leave to avoid scandal, to avoid lawsuits, to avoid bad press. And each time he simply moved on to another hospital, starting fresh, slipping into a new role with new patients and new opportunities to kill. No one filed criminal charges. No one warned the next hospital. And so, the bodies continued to pile up. Patients who should have recovered died suddenly, inexplicably. Families demanded answers. They were given none. Hospitals issued carefully worded statements, citing complications and underlying conditions. Some deaths were investigated, but nothing ever stuck. Cullen always had an explanation. Medications had been properly administered, he had followed protocol, and deaths in a hospital setting were, after all, not uncommon. And when there was no hard evidence, there was no case. Suspicion wasn't enough to convict a man who understood how to hide in plain sight. One hospital after another, Cullen continued his work in the shadows. He wore scrubs like any other nurse. He smiled at patients' families, reassured them, comforted them, all while knowing that death was only a syringe away. But eventually the whispers became louder. The unease among staff grew. And in the places where he worked, where nurses watched patients die under strange circumstances, people began to ask the question that should have been asked years earlier. Was Charles Cullen really a healer? Or was he something far worse? The list of hospitals where Cullen worked appears on screen, one after another, fading into the next. A silent record of places that had the chance to stop him, but didn't. For over a decade, Charles Cullen had moved through hospital after hospital, leaving behind a trail of unexplained deaths, grieving families, and whispers of something deeply wrong. He had mastered the art of disappearing just as suspicion began to build, quietly resigning from one facility and effortlessly slipping into another. But in 2003, his ability to evade justice finally began to crumble. It all started, as many of these stories do, with a quiet sense of unease, an instinct that something wasn't right, that too many patients were dying under circumstances that defied medical logic. And this time, someone was willing to act on that instinct. At Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey, where Cullen had been working for the past year, the pattern of deaths had become impossible to ignore. Patients who had been stable only hours before were suddenly experiencing cardiac emergencies, their hearts failing without a clear explanation. Some deteriorated so rapidly that doctors barely had time to respond. Others never woke up at all. These weren't patients in critical condition. They weren't expected to die. Yet time and time again they did. Nurses exchanged wary glances, whispered their concerns in hushed voices, but no one could prove anything. And in the world of medicine, where life and death often hang in a delicate balance, it was easy, too easy, to dismiss these deaths as tragic but inevitable. But then a hospital pharmacist noticed something disturbing. Certain medications, insulin, digoxin, and epinephrine, were being ordered at an unusual rate. These weren't common prescriptions, nor were they necessary for the patients who had received them. Some of these medications had been requested and then abruptly cancelled, never officially administered to anyone. And when the pharmacist traced the source of these requests, one name kept appearing over and over again: Charles Cullen. Why was a nurse who wasn't assigned to certain patients accessing their records? Why was he repeatedly ordering powerful drugs without any documented reason? And why did so many of the patients who had been in his orbit end up dead? The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to align, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. The hospital needed proof. That's when Amy Luffren, a critical care nurse who had worked alongside Cullen for months, was approached by the administration. At first she didn't want to believe it. Cullen had been her friend. He had been kind to her, had spoken about his daughters, and had shared shifts with her without ever once seeming like the kind of man who could do something monstrous. But when she was shown the medical records, the proof that he had been accessing files he had no reason to, that he had been ordering drugs linked to sudden deaths, she felt a wave of horror wash over her. She knew she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. And she knew that if he had done these things, then every shift she had worked beside him, every joke they had shared, every moment she had trusted him had been a lie. But uncovering the truth meant putting herself in danger. If Cullen suspected she was on to him, if he realized that she was no longer his friend but his enemy, what would he do? He had killed patients in secret, undetected, for over a decade. Would he be willing to kill again to protect himself? That was the risk Luffren faced when she agreed to work with investigators. It was a terrifying decision, but it was the only way to stop him. She was given a wire, a hidden recording device, and a mission to get Cullen to talk. It was a delicate operation. Cullen wasn't reckless. He wasn't the kind of killer who boasted about his crimes or sought attention. He was careful. He was methodical. If she pushed too hard, he would shut down. If he sensed a trap, he might disappear again, slipping away just as he had so many times before. Luffren had to act as though nothing had changed, as though she still saw him as a friend, as though she wasn't terrified of the man sitting across from her. And so, one evening she met him at a diner. The place was crowded, filled with the chatter of strangers, the clinking of silverware against plates. To anyone watching, they were just two colleagues catching up over a meal. But under the table, beneath the fabric of her clothing, the wire was recording every word. At first, the conversation was casual. Cullen was quiet, reserved, as he had always been. But then, slowly, she began to steer the discussion toward the hospital, toward the deaths, toward the suspicions. She watched his face carefully, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of fear. But instead he remained calm. Too calm. And then, in his eerily detached way, he started to talk. He didn't confess outright. He didn't say the words, "I killed them." But what he did say was enough. He admitted to accessing patient records he had no business looking at. He acknowledged that he had ordered medications that could be lethal. And when Luffren pressed him further, asking why he had done these things, he didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain it away. Instead, he simply stared at her, as if daring her to figure it out on her own. The moment was chilling. And it was enough. When investigators listened to the recordings, they knew they had what they needed. The hospital's suspicions had been confirmed. Cullen wasn't just a nurse. He was a predator. And for the first time in his long, deadly career, he was caught. The authorities moved quickly. With enough evidence to justify his arrest, the police finally took Charles Cullen into custody. But even as he sat in the interrogation room, he remained disturbingly calm. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't plead innocence. He didn't demand to know why he had been arrested. Instead, when investigators confronted him with the deaths, when they asked him how many people he had killed, Cullen gave them a number that made their blood run cold. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe 30. Maybe 40. It could be more." More? The very idea was staggering. If he was telling the truth, then he wasn't just a murderer, he was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But how many had he really killed? And why? Those were the questions that still haunted investigators as they prepared for the next stage of the case. Because even with Cullen behind bars, the full scope of his crimes was still unraveling. And what they would uncover next was even more horrifying than they had imagined. Would you have the courage to go undercover against a serial killer? Let us know in the comments below. After years of slipping through the cracks, of quietly walking away from one hospital and into another, Charles Cullen finally found himself where he couldn't escape, inside a police interrogation room. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lights harsh, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the recording equipment capturing every breath, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Across from him sat investigators who had spent months unraveling the mystery of his deadly career, but now they no longer needed to speculate. They had him. And they were about to hear the truth from the killer himself. For hours, Cullen remained disturbingly calm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't like other criminals who denied, who fought back, who tried to talk their way out of trouble. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't ask what they had on him. He didn't even flinch when they confronted him with the evidence. Instead, he sat in silence as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. And then, in a voice devoid of emotion, he admitted it. He had killed. Over and over again. More times than he could count. At first he gave them a number, 40. But even as he said it, the detectives knew it couldn't be true. The timeline, the pattern of deaths, the sheer number of hospitals he had worked at, all of it suggested a much higher count. When pressed further, Cullen simply shrugged. He didn't know the exact number. Maybe it was 100. Maybe more. The more investigators dug into his past, the more the horrifying possibility emerged. The real number could be as high as 400. 400 patients. 400 lives taken without anyone noticing, until now. If the estimates were correct, Charles Cullen wasn't just a serial killer. He was the most prolific serial killer in American history. But why? That was the question that haunted everyone. What drove a man who had taken an oath to heal to instead become an executioner in scrubs? When asked, Cullen gave a chilling explanation. He wasn't killing out of rage. He wasn't killing for money. He wasn't even killing for pleasure. He claimed, without remorse, that these were mercy killings. That he had ended suffering. That he had spared patients from what he saw as inevitable pain. But as investigators combed through the list of the dead, one fact stood out. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Some had been expected to recover. Some had only been in the hospital for routine procedures. They weren't in unbearable pain. They weren't at death's door. They had simply been unlucky. They had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, under the care of the wrong man. News of Cullen's confession sent shockwaves across the country. How could a man have gotten away with so much for so long? How had no one stopped him? Hospitals that had once turned a blind eye were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Families who had never questioned their loved one's sudden passing were now left wondering, had they been one of his victims? Could their mother, their father, their spouse, their child have been murdered in the very place that was supposed to keep them safe? And worst of all, would they ever truly know? By the time Charles Cullen stood in a courtroom, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his face expressionless as ever, the damage had already been done. The sheer weight of his crimes was staggering. So many lives stolen, so many families shattered, so many unanswered questions left hanging in the air like ghosts that would never rest. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The facts spoke for themselves. Cullen had confessed. The evidence was undeniable. And yet, as the trial unfolded, the question remained, was justice even possible for crimes of this scale? In 2006, the verdict was handed down. 18 consecutive life sentences. No chance of parole. No way out. The gavel struck like a final heartbeat, sealing his fate. Charles Cullen would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, the walls closing in on him just as they had on his victims in those cold, sterile hospital rooms. There would be no redemption, no second chance, and no opportunity to slip away as he had so many times before. This time the doors locked behind him and they would never open again. But was it enough? For the families sitting in that courtroom, clutching photos of the loved ones they had lost, the sentencing felt hollow. Cullen's life was over in every way that mattered, but their suffering had no end date. The people he had taken would never return. The words guilty and life in prison did not bring closure. And perhaps worst of all, the hospitals that had enabled him, that had chosen silence over action, that had allowed him to walk away rather than expose the horror happening under their own roofs, faced no real consequences. Administrators denied wrongdoing. Investigations were quietly closed. Policies were changed, but apologies were scarce. And so, the families of the victims were left with only a cruel truth. Justice had come, but far too late. Charles Cullen would never walk free again. But for those who had unknowingly trusted him with their lives, justice would always feel incomplete. Because the real question was never just about one man. It was about an entire system that had failed to stop him. Do you believe justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The horrors left in Charles Cullen's wake forced the medical world to take a hard look at its own failures. Hospitals across the country scrambled to implement new safety measures, automated drug tracking systems, tighter security around medication access, and stricter background checks for healthcare workers. No longer could a nurse like Cullen slip from one facility to another, leaving death in his path without raising alarms. But these changes came too late for the hundreds of lives he had already taken. And even now, they raise an unsettling question. If it took nearly 2 decades to catch him, how many others have gone unnoticed? Medical professionals are supposed to be the guardians of life, the ones we trust in our most vulnerable moments. But Cullen's case shattered that illusion, proving that even in the safest of places, danger can lurk undetected. Hospitals were meant to heal, yet for years they were his hunting ground. And while policies may have changed, human nature has not. Would another angel of death be stopped in time? Or would bureaucracy, fear of lawsuits, and the desperate need to protect reputations allow history to repeat itself? Because the truth is chilling. Charles Cullen was caught. But was he the only one? What do you think? Have hospitals truly learned from their mistakes, or do they still prioritize reputation over patient safety? Let us know in the comments. If this case shook you, hit the like button and subscribe for more shocking true crime stories. Next week, we uncover the terrifying truth behind a nurse who was killing patients in their sleep, and no one noticed. You won't want to miss it. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will keep you up at night.